Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. And it's my pleasure to welcome to today's program Ben Cubitt, who is Senior Vice President of Consulting and Engineering at Transplace. And today we're going to talk about becoming a shipper of choice for carriers. Now, this is a term, shippers of choice, that we hear a lot and we've heard a lot over the years. Certainly, during times when trucking capacity starts getting tight. And the question is, well, what exactly does shipper of choice mean? What are some of the things that are important to carriers that shippers can do, so on and so forth. And certainly Ben is an experienced executive in the transportation world, and certainly look forward to his insights today on this very timely topic. But before we get started, just want to remind those of you that are joining us live today that part of our goal here at Talking Logistics is to make this conversational. So if you've got a question or a comment for Ben, you can do so via the question button at the bottom of the screen there, or via the chat feature. And certainly, if we've got time and it's a good and relevant question, we'll try to weave it into the conversation. If you are joining us as a visitor, you will have to sign up first before you can ask a question. So with that, Ben, welcome to the program.
Good morning. Thank you, Adrian.
So Ben, before we kind of start talking about shipper of choice and what that means, I always like to ask my guests, get some background in terms of how they even got into this industry. So why don't you briefly tell us a little bit about your career path, how and why you got into supply chain logistics, and what your current role and responsibilities are there at Transplace?
Great. Yeah, like a lot of folks, I got into supply chain 25 plus years ago, and kind of accidentally. Didn't have a supply chain degree. Actually had a history. It was a history major undergrad, and after college went in the Army for 4 years, and then came out and started my business career. And I actually started with a large automotive tier one supplier, and they wanted me to go in supply chain. They had a cross training program, and I was living in Seattle, and I started managing a warehouse. And the last thing in the world I thought I would ever do. And then from there, I got into transportation, and I've been involved. Two-thirds of my career has been on the shipper side with companies like Federal Mogul, Midwest Vaco, Rock 10, and then one-third on consulting 3PL. And I've managed warehouses, a lot of transportation, inventory, network optimization. So a lot of broad areas in the supply chain. It's been a great 25 plus years. I think supply chain's a great field. I really enjoyed it. But like a lot of folks back in the day, I got into it without a plan. I planned on going to law school actually. And so that's my background at Transplace. I'm Senior Vice President of Engineering and Consulting and Carrier Management. And so work in those areas with both our existing 3PL customers, our new customers coming on board, and then external customers that aren't 3PL customers.
Yeah, great background. I always love it when folks have worked in multiple sides of supply chains. So obviously, with your experience both on the shipper side and on the 3PL side, and working with carriers, you've worn many shoes and many hats, over your 25-year career. And again, I think another example of someone that probably didn't know what supply chain management was going in, and now is well entrenched in that area. I always joke. I mean, my background's in engineering, material science engineering, and I started my career manufacturing at Motorola and then at Polaroid. And but now it's been 16 plus years since I've been kind of looking at supply chain and logistics, and love it for all the reasons that you cited as well. Just a lot of great things going on there. And of course, one of those great things is what's happening in transportation today, because it's never a dull moment when it comes to transportation. So let's talk about shipper of choice. And I know that you recently did a survey, I believe, of carriers that kind of provided some insight on this whole topic. But why don't to kind of start off, what does it mean to be a preferred shipper or shipper of choice, and why is it important?
Yeah, actually, there is a lot of uncertainty about the term, and I think most shippers, as this market seems to transition from what was one of the shipper friendliest environments that we've seen with the recession 2008, 2009, as capacity is tightening and as it seems to be shifting to a little bit more of a balanced, if not a carrier market. I think shippers are very interested. We actually had our customers ask us in our customer advisory board, can you go out to carriers, survey carriers, and really find out how they view preferred shippers. What does it mean to be a preferred shipper? If a carrier is evaluating us, or in a market, if a carrier has X amount of trucks and they're deciding who to give trucks to, if it's tight, we came through this polar vortex this winter where markets were very tight. If they're making decisions, we want to make sure they're choosing us. So, your question, what does it mean to be a preferred shipper, shipper of choice? We'll go into that detail. We tried to put some data behind it, as you mentioned, with the survey, talking to some carriers. We did some workshops to try to really dig deep and try to get into what it really means. What does it mean to a carrier? What makes a preferred shipper? And why it's important is because it's all about capacity. As companies expand, as they grow, as transportation professionals, we're always looking to optimize cost and service performance, but it all starts with having a truck that will pick up the product and take it to a customer. That's the essential kind of function that we have to perform.
I think that I don't know if it's just at my end, but it seems like your camera froze a little bit. Can you still hear me, Ben?
I can. Yeah.
Okay, great. Maybe it's just at my end. Hopefully, everyone who's watching is able to see the video fine. And if not, please post a comment so that I'm aware if that's still an issue. I think it's interesting that the drive for finding out what shipper of choice means came from your shipper clients in terms of trying to get some insight from the carriers that you work with in terms of what does that mean. So let's talk a little bit about what you found from the survey. I mean, what are some of the key factors that in how transportation carriers rate shippers in terms of what they see important from a shipper for the shippers that they want to work with?
Yeah, it was an interesting process, Adrian. As we looked at that, I would say that carriers had some initial observations, and they were pretty common, and we had to really push to try to get as much detail as we can. We actually did a survey, then we did a revised survey, and then we did carrier workshops to really try to dig deeper and put some detail around it. And as we kind of went through those iterations, I think it helped us peel the onion back a little bit more and a little bit more. And as we talked to a group of carriers, we would get some more ideas, some more areas to explore, and then we'd go deeper. And what we really learned is that, and this is not a surprise, but what's important to the carriers right now, I would say, is two things. It's all about efficiency and helping them operate their networks efficiently in what is a very tough industry. And then it's all about retaining a driver and driver efficiency. So if you look at the carrier market today, it's relatively tough to be a carrier. We're coming through a couple of years when the market was very tough. All of their costs are increasing, cost of maintenance, cost of equipment, new tractors, new trailers are much more expensive than they were historically. And then recruiting, retaining drivers is critical. So as we looked at this, the number one thing we came away, I don't know if it was an epiphany, but what really struck us was the carriers weren't looking at anything exotic. It really came down to the basics of, as a shipper, are you helping me make my network efficient? And are you helping me retain drivers? I think that was critical. Drivers only make money when they're moving. So are your facilities set up? Are your policies set up? The way you tender freight to us, the way you load, unload our trucks,
It seems that we lost Ben there for a second. Let me go ahead and bring him back up on camera. Thank you, Brian, for letting me know. Let me go ahead and see if I could bring Brian back on. Brian, I don't know if you can. I assume you can see or hear me, but for some reason we lost you there. I'm going to go ahead and invite you on camera and see if we can get you back on.
Hi, are we back?
Hey, Ben.
Hey, Adrian.
Okay, we lost you. You're back. So you were just wrapping up there on kind of making those last points regarding what carriers were deeming as important, which was one, efficiency, and then in terms of the keeping the trucks moving. I was going to quickly ask a follow-up question on there. One of the things I hear a lot about is that concerns a lot of carriers is dwell time, right? So they go and they arrive for a pickup or a delivery, and then they're made to sit and wait, at the dock or for 2, 3 hours, right? So not only is that impacting the efficiency side of things, but it's also impacting the driver in terms of, is there is the driver made to wait inside the truck, or is there at least an area that the driver can, relax or be productive, or while they're waiting to load or unload? The dwell time come up as an issue or something that you heard from the carriers?
It did, and I'd like to dig into that. And let me, you got cut off, but when we did our survey and as we got the results back, we kind of broke it into 4 areas. And so when carriers look at shippers, they look at first the overall rating of the shipper. What kind of volume potential is there? Are the rates attractive? Is the fuel surcharge attractive? Are the accessorials fair? And then what's the volume potential? Things like the credit rating, all the things you'd expect. So kind of a shipper profile, and also just the freight of that shipper match up with their network. So that's one area that carriers look at. The next area they look at is driver productivity, and that's really essential, and dwell time is part of that. So when they look at driver productivity, they look at dwell time. When my driver gets there, if it's a live unload, are you getting them in and out? Is it easy to get around your facility? If it's a drop trailer, is the drop trailer ready? So it's one thing to have a drop trailer, but when I get in, is the trailer loaded? Is it empty? Sometimes the carrier comes in, the very worst would be a carrier comes in with an empty trailer and there's no loaded trailer. And the shipper wants you to actually leave the empty trailer and come back later and get it, which would really be bad. Also look at things like shipper load and count. Does the driver have to touch the freight? In these days, retention of drivers, it's really going to be unappealing if the driver has to touch the freight, if they have to count the inventory. One thing that came up, which was a surprise, was just how important weekend loading and unloading is. A 24/7 shipper, a 24/7 facility is very important to carriers, and that came across over and over. So when we talk about driver productivity, being able to load that driver at different times, keep that driver moving. It's all about keeping the driver moving. The other 2 areas we looked at was driver-friendly facility. You talked about that. When the driver gets there, can they go to the restroom? Are there vending machines? Equally important is there parking for the driver. That's really a big issue. I know we were going to talk about hours of service, but if the driver gets there early, and carriers are really looking for more flexibility. If the driver gets there early and the load's not going to be ready for 4 or 5 hours, can they go park on the lot and take a break? It's really a challenge for the driver and for the carrier if there's no parking on site and the driver now has to go 4, 5, 10 miles down the road to a crowded truck stop. Because if they have to do that, of course, they're using some of their available hours, and with hours of service and everything, that's more of a challenge. The last thing the carrier looks at of these 4 areas we looked at was relationship. How is the carrier treated? Are they brought additional opportunities? Many carriers today, in addition to having over-the-road capability, have intermodal capability, have dedicated fleet. So does the shipper let the carrier get opportunities in all the different areas, buckets of revenue that they have? So as we looked at all of those, those were the areas that they looked at. But it was really interesting, Adrian. It came back to dwell time, load and unload, 24/7. Are you keeping my trucks moving? That was what was really important as they evaluate shippers.
Yeah, no, in many ways, it makes sense. Those are the things that, when you look at what drives the economics of carriers, all those things are kind of aligned, with that. And you mentioned kind of hours of service and as part of your comments there. So I'm curious, I mean, have the priorities changed or influenced in any way because of regulations such as hours of service or even CSA?
Yeah, they absolutely have, and I think many shippers still have a lot to do to kind of fully understand that, and to if we look at the driver as a shared resource, as an industry, as transportation supply chain professionals, I think the biggest challenge we all face is driver availability. And so as an industry, we need to do a better job supporting recruiting drivers, retaining drivers, keeping drivers in this industry. And so when you look at hours of service, as we dug deeper and talked about this, it's things like, when do you tender me freight? A lot of carriers don't have 24/7 operations. And so if they're the primary on a lane and you tender it to them in the evening, they may not have anyone there to accept it, even if there's a 3-day lead time. So, you really want to think about things like that. Also, what length of haul? We talked with one shipper who had one of the best kind of carrier-friendly programs, and they had engineered their lanes so that as they got later in the week, they were giving the carriers longer haul, so that if you tender the carrier freight on Friday, they can get maximum driving over the weekend. So instead of tendering them a load that'll go 200 miles, which is, okay, by the time I pick it up, if it's got delivered Monday, I just have to sit on it. Whereas if I'm tendering them a load that may have to go 1,800 miles, they can pick it up in Friday afternoon, and if that driver's got hours, they can, drive and get 2 or 3 days of productivity over the weekend. So I think there's a real opportunity for shippers, for 3PLs, as we look at engineering our network, as we look at how we tender freight, as we look at what carriers we match up with. I think working with carriers to be more sensitive to, are we helping their efficiency? Are we tying into that driver's capacity? Same way, if we're asking a driver to come into Atlanta or Los Angeles and pick up a load at 8 a.m., I hate driving to the airport in Atlanta at 7 or 8 a.m. If I've got a 10 o'clock flight, which isn't often, I still leave my house at 6 in the morning, because otherwise I'll be in traffic for 2 hours. So, we have to look at that. What if we're tendering freight that's going to put a driver right into congestion in places like Atlanta, Chicago, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., that's really an impact on driver productivity and the hours they have available. So instead of driving at 55 miles an hour, 52 miles an hour, they're sitting in traffic.
No, those are all great points, and you talked about kind of making the life of a driver, not only making him more productive, but also kind of easing the strenuous nature of being a driver, and retention being one of those things that a lot of carriers struggle with. In kind of a related topic, I wrote recently a blog post about the driver shortage, and I advocated for a plan B. And I was surprised by the number of comments that I received, both on the Talking Logistics website as well as on LinkedIn. And there were a number of people that kind of agreed that there was a driver shortage problem, but there are many folks that kind of disagreed and said, well, is there really a driver shortage problem? Because if I look at driver wages, they haven't been going up, and the laws of supply and demand would say that if there was a shortage, you would see those rates going up, and people questioning kind of they say the freight always finds a way to move, so there really isn't a shortage. So I mean, you obviously work with a lot of carriers, and shippers as well, and you've been on both sides. I mean, what's your take on driver shortage and kind of what you're seeing and hearing out in the field today?
Yeah, I think it is one of those, you get this difference of opinion. There are some shippers that are skeptical if there really is a crisis, and I hear the same things. It's just a pay issue. If we would raise the pay, we would get all the drivers we want. Or the same things, because rates aren't necessarily going up, that must mean that that there's not this pressure, or else we'd be raising it and we'd raise their salary. But I think at the end of the day, you look at the facts, because if you go talk to carriers, as I visit carriers, that's what they want to talk about, and that's their number one issue. And they're either all on message across their whole company, or it's really an issue. And the finance people talk about it, the customer service people talk about it. Their flat screen TVs, that's their whole message across their whole organization. despite what they're saying, if you just go around there, I remember I visited one trucking company and, they had a lot of flat screen TVs that had messaging going on, and it was all about driver retention and rates. And when I looked at it, Adrian, I go visit carriers, and carriers, I visited a carrier recently, and I said, what are you guys up to? About 1,000 trucks? And they said, no, we're up to about 800. And I said, wait a minute, I think of you as 900 on your way to 1,000. They said, no, we just turned in a bunch of trucks and we didn't buy as many. And this is somebody I've known for 25 years. And they said, 10% of my fleet is parked on the fence, Ben, and I'm rejecting loads at a record amount. And, it's all about drivers. And they shared with me that their driver recruiters are probably only giving them about 2/3 of their requirement each week. And so I think the statistics tell. I mean, if you go to carriers, they have trucks against the fence. That the only reason they have them against the fence is because they can't find drivers. I go to carrier after carrier that we'd like to grow business with, small regionals, nationals, and they say, Ben, we'd love to grow, but we can't find drivers. It's everything. If we've got 400 trucks, it's all of our effort to keep 90% of those with drivers in the seat. I think also if you look at the size of fleets, we've been watching that statistics for years. So, the fleets aren't growing. There's any number of statistics. If you take the 10 largest trucking companies and you look at how many trucks they have, that number is down, not up over the years. And so the other thing I would add to it is, I give a lot of presentations, some speeches at CSMP, different places, and I always ask the audience, if I'm talking about drivers, how many people are raising their children to be truck drivers? And I've used that line 30 times in the last couple of years, and there's been very few raised hands. And I think that reason is it's a tough lifestyle. And, we have some discussion inside our company. I'm not sure that rate increases that then support driver increased pay will really change that. It is a very, very tough lifestyle. You have to be away from your family. You don't take, even if you're driving through Montana, you don't take your breaks looking at the mountains. You take your breaks in a truck stop and you shower in a public shower and you eat truck stop food, right? So it is a very tough lifestyle. And I believe the driver shortage is real. I think it's increasing. And it's a challenge for all of us as supply chain professionals.
Great insights there. And I agree with your point. I mean, I basically that's my counter argument back to folks that point to supply, say supply and demand, and the lack of wage increases points to no driver shortage. I said, look, you talk to the carriers, and any carrier that's a good business person would not be forfeiting revenue. It would not be keeping assets idled because they don't want to pay drivers more. Certainly, you can make a great case that drivers should be paid more because of the type of lifestyle that they have to lead, and that may help a little bit, but it's not going to attract the number of carriers, a number of drivers that is really needed out in the industry to meet demand. I just yeah, go ahead.
Just one follow-up comment on that. I think shippers rightfully so say, okay, if there's this driver crisis and if it keeps getting worse, and I see all these statistics, why don't I have more pain related to that? And I think Tom Albrecht and some other folks, I've seen some analysis that talks about the counter trend. So as we shift, there's been a lot of optimization of supply chain over the last 10 years. Shippers have moved a lot of over-the-road freight to intermodal. I think that TMSs like ours at Transplace, we've made it more efficient. We've tied lanes together. We've helped shippers increase the average cube, average weight per trailer. So there's been a lot of efforts there that have mitigated the impact of the driver shortage. So I think that's the flip side of that. But I think those supply chain efficiencies can only go so far. I think we really are at the point when you look at like the weather events that we had in January, February. Whenever you have an imbalance of the network, you really see the driver shortage a little bit more. I think as the economy grows, Okay, I'm back. Sorry. Adrian, am I back?
I can still hear
I
you.
think I dropped off for a second. Okay, sorry, I dropped off. But I think that that's been one of the counters, and I think that you know, it'll become more evident, the driver challenge, as those efficiencies become harder and harder to reach.
Yeah, no, I think those are all great follow-up points. I mean, you're kind of frozen on my camera. I know you can hear me. I assume other folks can still see your video. If that's not the case, just let me know. I also want to remind those of you that are watching live that we're kind of coming up short on time here. So if you do have a question or a comment for Ben, now would be the time to to post it either via the chat feature or the question feature. So to kind of to move on then and talk about another topic that I think is getting a lot of attention these days, and that's scorecards. And certainly shippers have been using scorecards for a long time to kind of evaluate their carriers. But now we're starting to see carriers actually use scorecards as well to evaluate shippers. I mean, what kind of metrics are they looking at, and why the sudden rise in the use of scorecards by carriers?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it was one of the ones our shippers asked us. They say, "Hey, we do all these scorecards. We're scorecarding all of our carriers. Are the carriers scorecarding us?" And they kind of asked that kind of sheepishly. And so when we did our survey, it was interesting. We found about 50%. It's actually 47% of the carriers we surveyed, which was a large group, do have carrier scorecards. And we looked at some of the carrier scorecards. So I think there's two reasons that shippers scorecard. That carrier scorecard shippers more and more. One, I think truckload carriers are becoming more data driven. I think they, like everybody in the supply chain, it's all about data. It's all about fact-based decisions. So I think carriers are becoming more that way. And I think carriers, it has been a very difficult 4 or 5 years. And so I think carriers are having to do everything they can to get an adequate return on the business. They've certainly made huge efforts to make their fleets more efficient, to do a better job planning, to buy better. And so I think evaluation of shippers and is this shipper contributing to my margin, to my network efficiency, to my business is just something, that's just another part of evaluating the business, managing and running the business. And again, I think carriers are becoming more fact-based. I think, we have carrier scorecards, we have shipper scorecards. I think where we need to migrate is to more of a network scorecard where shippers and carriers and 3PLs are on the same side of the desk and we're identifying opportunities to make the network more efficient. Maybe that's the next thing we need is a shared network scorecard.
Great insights. We've got a question here. I want to put it up on the air from Joe. A couple of questions actually. So let me go ahead and do that. And let's see, are there any independent third-party surveys that have drivers rate specific shipper facilities with regards to entry and exit time, timely load, unload, etc.?
I'm not aware of any, and I don't believe there are any. I've never heard anybody reference. There have been a few efforts. I can't remember. It's not the ATA, but another association kind of created a list of kind of facility best practices in general. It was kind of generic, but there's been a couple efforts like that. But to my knowledge, there have not been, and I think it'd be very difficult data to collect. I don't know who would have collected that and shared it. So I'm pretty confident that there's not anything like that out there.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting question, Joe. So it's almost like the equivalent of a Yelp or one of these things you see on the consumer side where people can rate restaurants or provide reviews of things. I can certainly see some drivers getting together and launching something like that. That would provide some very interesting insights to shippers, and who knows, it might drive some of the shippers to if the reviews are actually valid and accurate, it might drive some change. So it's a great question, Joe. I think you asked another one. I'm going to go ahead and put that one up on the screen as well. And let's read it over here. Does the contracting process need to be disrupted between shippers and carriers? I would wager 98% of all transportation agreements have sections where shipper guarantees no loads and carriers do not guarantee trucks. If the contract has real commitments for both sides with penalties and bonus features, would this help with capacity? Both parties have more skin in the game.
I think that is a great question, and we have a very active procurement practice. We do over 100 truckload, LTL, ocean procurement events each year for shippers, and that's one of the questions up front that we get asked. And especially if the procurement folks are involved for the first time, they'll be surprised that there's kind of no guarantees on either end. And we actually did some surveys of that 2 years ago. We went out and talked to lots of carriers, lots of shippers. Does anybody have guarantees in their contracts? Does anybody have penalties? And you find out that there's really not much of that. And I think the difficulty is that supply chains are so, we continue to be surprised. We do a bid and we find that over and over 25% of a shipper's lanes change each year. So there's new lanes, volumes change. You ship production from one plant to the other plant. And when we actually show shippers the statistics, they are always surprised. And when we do network optimization projects, they're always surprised that their view of their network doesn't necessarily match the data. And I say all that to say that it would be pretty hard to put guarantees in. So if a shipper said, I'm going to give you 20 loads a week on this lane, they would have a tough time guaranteeing that, especially across a whole year. I have seen a lot of shippers, and I think rightfully so, focused on doing a better job of forecasting. So I think as an industry, we could do a better job forecasting week to week. What does the volume look like? If we have a seasonal spike, if we expect a promotion, so we continually kind of go to the carrier who we normally give 10 loads a week. They're our primary carrier. This week we offer them 50 loads and they can't take them all, and we're surprised and upset, right? And the carrier's on the other end going, I've got my network set up. You told me you'd give me 20 a week and I only got 2, or I got all 20 on Monday. And of course, so I think it is a real challenge for the industry. I think it's going to be difficult on both sides to put penalties on it. What do you do if the trucks were held up? What do you do about the weather? What if we had guarantees this winter and somebody in Chicago is trying to hold a carrier responsible for not having trucks when their trucks are tied up in Atlanta because of an ice storm? So I think we need to do a better job of forecasting. I think putting penalties in is going to be difficult, but I do think that kind of the relationship we have now where there aren't very strong commitments on either side is a challenge for the industry.
Great question, Joe. Great response there, Ben. I think it is an interesting trait of transportation agreements in terms of the and how they differ from traditional type of contracts with the lack of true kind of guarantees, if you will, and commitments. I mean, I think one of the things you mentioned there, Ben, that I've seen increased discussion over the past few years is, having better forecasting, and by that I mean having a rolling forecast where, a lot of times where, when you do a procurement engagement, you're basing, your capacity requirements based on what you did last year and based on forecasts on this point in time. But as you know, things change, once the year starts, and it's the ability to provide carriers with a rolling forecast and forward visibility in terms of their capacity requirements and continuously updating that. I mean, some of the counter arguments I've heard to that is that, well, there's only so much forward visibility a carrier can use because they don't know where their assets are going to be, 5, 6, 7 weeks from now. But I counter that, by having that visibility, nonetheless, it does, if all shippers provided that visibility, there might be ways that carriers can leverage that. And of course, there could be technology companies that can provide some technology to be able to use that data, that forward visibility, to make some smarter operational decisions, on an ongoing basis versus kind of taking what was thought of as the best available information at the time of the procurement engagement and kind of not living with that for the rest of the year. What are your thoughts on that, Ben?
Yeah, I think I have, as we were talking, I think probably 3 different comments. So the first one is, I think we're guilty of not even doing the basics. As a former shipper, I may know a plant's going to close or that we're opening a new plant and the plant's going to close in 60 days or it even has closed. I don't think very often I close the loop with carriers. I think we just quit tendering them the freight. We didn't tell them hey, we're going to close this facility and you're in 8 lanes. And, sometimes we do, but a lot of times we don't. So there's probably better information sharing there that should happen just as a basic. The second one is forecasts are a challenge, but we certainly at Transplace believe strongly that as we come into known events like end of quarter promotions, end of month promotions, seasonal challenges like produce in the southeast, or some of the things that hit California as a market for intermodal or truckload, we want to be meeting with the carriers in advance and giving them as much information. This is what we expect this year, or this customer that we have has a pack season or some other season. We've learned that it's much better to talk with the carriers in advance, even if you're not sure exactly what's going to happen or how severe it's going to be. Something's going to happen, and so you want to get them in the planning, and you want to have them let you know what they can do. So I think that type planning is very important. I think forecasting. I think it is true that carriers, if you tell them what's going to happen 2 weeks out, if you tender the freight 2 weeks out, it's kind of not helpful to them. 24 hours is a challenge, 48 is still a challenge, 72 hours is pretty good. But if you tell them 8 days out, to some extent, they're not sure how many trucks they're going to have that day. But I think if you forecast it, and if it's going to be severe, a major impact, a major spike, up or down, I think with your port carriers, we certainly believe they should be having conversations, letting them know we're going to need more trucks. Are you in a position to do it? And it just avoids a mess and finger pointing when it happens.
Yeah, great points. I mean, I think from a visibility standpoint, providing forward visibility, I think from my standpoint, it's less about yes, if you're tendering 2 weeks out, that's not going to be very helpful for a carrier. But it's really kind of looking at the deltas between, hey, 3 months from now, we're actually going to need, we're anticipating that we're going to need, 10% more trucks on this lane than we thought, when we first just this procurement engagement. And by having that visibility, maybe there might be things that would bring both parties back to the discussion table to say, okay, how can we support this spike in that you're anticipating now in demand capacity 3 months from now, versus kind of having that conversation at the 11th hour, and vice versa. Maybe maybe it's a contraction in capacity requirements, and being able to provide that forward visibility to the carrier so that they can make the adjustments in terms of what they're planning 3 months out, 6 months out. But we're kind of getting short on time here, so I'm going to go straight to my last question, Ben. And really, it's as a way to wrap up. What advice, best practices would you recommend for shippers to implement, with their carrier base to become, shippers of choice?
So I think the first thing is participating in events like this, asking, looking what information's out there. So first, educating yourself. What is important to carriers? There's a lot of information out there. We've certainly done interviews and articles about it. So begin there, and then we're going to develop a checklist for facilities working with some carriers. We'll be coming out with that soon, because I think a lot of shippers really don't know, and they've never looked at their facilities. So I think an assessment of your facilities, your practices, so first understand what's important to carriers, understand, what your facilities should be doing, what you should be doing, then do an assessment, and then start talking to your carriers about it, and really involving the carriers and asking for that feedback. Don't be afraid to ask that feedback. How do you rate us? How are we doing? I think one of the challenges for the industry, I spoke about this at an ATA panel recently, is I think truckload carriers still don't share enough data. So the data exchange is kind of one way. I think railroads and LTL carriers to some extent have done a better job with that historically, kind of giving the shipper detailed information. So I think carriers and shippers need to move to more of a fact-based discussion. The question we had earlier, is there a website that can tell if a facility's a driver unfriendly facility? Don't be surprised by that. Start talking to your carriers and ask for data. Become really challenge your truckload carriers to collect and share data with you about how the network's performing. How does my lead time, my tender lead time compare? Are there things I could do better to help? What are your challenges? Well, we have challenges getting our trucks fully utilized over the weekend. Okay, are there things we can do better? So Adrian, I think that's one of the huge opportunities is to have shippers collect that information, assess where they stand, and then start talking to carriers and ask carriers for data about them and about the industry. Because certainly as supply chain professionals, if we need to make an investment, if we need to add drop trailer lot to our, that's the last investment a company is going to want to make. So if you have data, that helps. If the carrier can show that your facilities are not well designed, are not equal to your peers and competitors for that trucking capacity, that data can really help you to make an argument internally to improve.
Yeah, no, great advice. I mean, it reminds me of growing up in New York City. We had a mayor, Ed Koch, and one of his famous lines was, how am I doing? He would go around asking all the residents down the street, how am I doing? How am I doing? So as you were kind of providing that advice in terms of really reaching out to the carriers and basically asking them, how am I doing as a shipper, and getting that, insight and getting some of that data, from the carriers would certainly help. As a way to wrap up, we did get one more question in. I think it relates to kind of your last comments here, so I'm just going to put it up from Kevin. And he asked, did carriers express the need for visibility for a customer to be a shipper of choice? This would lead to better planning and increased productivity. And then great job today, Mr. Cubitt.
Um, I think carriers, it's interesting. Shippers share their scorecards with carriers more and more. Carriers don't really share their scorecards. We found that if they did have scorecards, they really weren't sharing them with shippers. So I think carriers are a little gun shy about that. I mean, it has been such a shipper market that carriers really haven't wanted to do anything to alienate a shipper because they needed. It's interesting. I think it's really shifted. 4 or 5 years ago, they needed that load more than anything, and I think today they need that driver more than anything. And I think as shippers, many carriers are getting to the point they need that driver more than they need your load. They need both, and so I think carriers will become more open to that. I think that I think there is a need for that, but I think carriers have been a little gun shy to really talk too much about that. But I think that'll change as some of these market dynamics change.
Great question, Kevin, and Joe. Thank you for your questions earlier. And with that, we're out of time for today. So Ben, again, I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us today.
I enjoyed it. Thank you, Adrian.
And again, thank you to all of us that joined us live today on today's program. If you are watching this episode on demand and you do have a question or a comment for Ben, you can find the episode on talkinglogistics.com. And you can post a question or comment there, and I'm sure Ben will be more than happy to respond via that platform. So with that, again, thank you all for joining us today, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.